Please don't forget to subscribe, give a like, and click notifications so you don't miss any new content. James Smith, a real estate mogul with a keen eye for business, walked through the aisles of his supermarket with a serious expression. It wasn't common for him to spend much time on this side business, but lately, something had caught his attention. From his sleek office on the second floor, with panoramic views of the store, he had started to notice small anomalies. In particular, small amounts of money were missing from the cash register at the end of the day. Although the amounts weren't significant for someone at his level, the idea that one of his employees might be stealing from him was something he could not tolerate. The supermarket, located in one of the most exclusive areas of the city, was designed to attract high-end clientele. James, always a perfectionist, remained vigilant about details that others might overlook. He often reviewed the security cameras from his office, observing the behavior of the employees and the customers. Emily, a young employee at the supermarket, had started to stand out for reasons James couldn't quite explain. She was discreet, she worked well, but there was something in the way she moved and in the sadness she often carried in her eyes that made her seem distant. There was something about her that made him uneasy, something that kept him alert. That afternoon, after reviewing the financial records again and confirming another small discrepancy, James decided he could no longer ignore his suspicions. He knew he had to act. He watched the security cameras from his computer, focusing on Emily as she attended to customers. Could she be the one responsible? At the end of Emily's shift, when the supermarket was almost empty, James descended to the sales floor. The atmosphere was calm at that hour, the supermarket lights reflecting off the polished shelves, and the echo of the few remaining customers resonating in the vast space. "Emily, can you come here for a moment?" James said, his voice calm but firm. Emily, surprised, turned towards him, with a mix of nervousness and confusion on her face. She wasn't used to interacting directly with the owner, much less being called in such an unexpected way. "Of course, Mr. Smith," she replied, trying not to show her discomfort as she approached him. James led her to his office, where the atmosphere was much more intimidating. The office was decorated with dark, elegant furniture, and from the large windows, the sunset painted the city in an orange hue. In contrast to the warmth outside, the office interior was cold and distant, just like its owner. "Sit down," James ordered, pointing to a chair in front of his desk. Emily obeyed, though the nervousness in her chest grew. Her hands trembled slightly, and her breathing quickened. She didn't know what this was about, but James's intense gaze made her uncomfortable. "I've noticed small amounts of money missing from the register," James began, as he intertwined his fingers and observed her attentively. "I want you to explain to me what's going on." Emily fell silent for a moment, perplexed by the accusation. The lump in her throat tightened with each passing second. "I haven't taken anything, Mr. Smith. I don't know what you're talking about." James watched her closely. Her words sounded sincere, but the uncertainty in her gaze made him think that maybe there was something she wasn't willing to admit. "Are you sure?" he insisted. "Look, I don't want any trouble. I just want to know what's going on. If there's something you need to tell me, now is the time." Emily shook her head, desperate to clear the situation. "I don't know anything. I just come to work and do my job. I haven't stolen anything." The silence that followed was unbearable. James stared at her, considering her words. Something didn't fit, but it wasn't exactly what he thought. Determined to press a bit more, James took a risky step. "I want you to open your bag," he said bluntly, his voice low but loaded with authority. Emily looked at him in surprise, her eyes widening in shock at the request. "My bag, but why?" "Please, just do it," he insisted, keeping his gaze cold and calculating. Emily's fingers trembled as she unhooked her bag from her shoulder and placed it on the desk. She opened it slowly and pushed it towards James, who took it without hesitation. He began to search through its contents, a wallet, some keys, a notebook. Everything seemed normal, until his eyes landed on an old, worn photograph. When James pulled it out of the bag, his heart stopped for an instant. The photograph showed a young woman with dark hair, smiling warmly. His expression changed immediately. That woman was no stranger. It was Sofía. The woman he had deeply loved and who had disappeared from his life more than 20 years ago. "Where did you get this?" James asked, his voice filled with astonishment and repressed emotion. Emily, visibly confused, leaned forward to see the picture. That's my mother," she replied, unable to comprehend the impact this image was having on her boss. "She died when I was little. I barely remember her." James stood frozen. The pieces began to fall into place in his mind. He looked at Emily again, her eyes, her features, everything matched Sofía. A flood of emotions overwhelmed him. Could Emily be the daughter Sofía never told him about? As James processed what he had just discovered, his mind began to travel back in time. His relationship with Sofía had been passionate but tumultuous. At that time, James was an ambitious young man, obsessed with building his real estate empire. Sofía, on the other hand, was a free-spirited artist who had dreamed of starting a family. The news of Sofía's pregnancy had not been well received by James. They had had a terrible argument, full of hurtful words that he now deeply regretted. "The last time I saw your mother," James began, his voice trembling slightly, "we argued. I was so blinded by my ambitions that I didn't see what really mattered. I said things I never should have said, and she left. I never saw her again." Emily listened in silence, trying to process what she was hearing. Her mother had never spoken much about her life before Emily was born. It had always been a taboo subject, a mystery that Emily had learned not to touch. "I always thought she abandoned me," James whispered, his voice now barely audible. "That she decided to live her life without me. But now I see there was more, something I never knew." James suddenly stood up, as if a new determination had taken over him. "We have to know the truth," he said, looking at Emily with renewed intensity. "If you're really my daughter, I can't go on living in ignorance." Emily, though confused and overwhelmed by the situation, nodded. "Okay, let's do the DNA test. I need answers as much as you do." That night, as James drove to the clinic with Emily sitting in the passenger seat, both were lost in their own thoughts. Emily stared out the window, watching the city lights flash by, while her mind tried to process what was happening. James, for his part, replayed his relationship with Sofía over and over, wondering if there was anything he could have done to prevent the tragedy that had torn them apart. As the relationship between James and Emily began to develop and the uncertainty about their bond grew, things at home were becoming complicated. Sarah, James's current wife, had always trusted her husband, but lately, she had noticed something was wrong. James was spending more time away from home and seemed distant, as if a constant worry was haunting him. His evasive answers only increased the doubts that were eating away at her. One night, during dinner in their elegant dining room, Sarah decided to confront James. "James, you've been very distant lately," she began, her voice calm but with a hint of tension. "Is there something you're not telling me?" James looked up from his plate. He knew this moment would come sooner or later. He had tried to keep Sarah in the dark, but it was clear that he could no longer avoid the subject. "Sarah," he sighed, placing his cutlery on the table. "Something has come up, something from the past that I never thought I'd have to face again." Sarah looked at him, visibly worried. The thought of an affair briefly crossed her mind, but something in James's expression told her this was much deeper. "What's going on?" she insisted, this time more firmly. "Does this have to do with another woman?" James shook his head, aware that the topic wouldn't be easy to address. "It's not what you think, Sarah. This is about someone who was part of my life many years ago, before I met you," he said, lowering his gaze. "It's about Sofía." At the mention of that name, Sarah felt a knot in her stomach. Sofía had been a name rarely mentioned in their home, and when it was, it was only in passing. She knew Sofía had been important in James's life, but she had never had clear details about the story. Sofía had been a ghost from the past, never a threat, until now. What does Sofía have to do with this? Sarah asked, her tension evident. James took a deep breath and decided to tell her what had happened in the last few days. A few days ago, I met a young employee at the supermarket. Emily. I thought she might be stealing money from the register, but what I found was something I never imagined. Emily is Sofía's daughter, and, he paused, looking directly into her eyes. She might be my daughter too. The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah froze, unable to process what she had just heard. A mixture of fear, jealousy, and confusion began to brew inside her. She had never imagined that something like this could break into their marriage. You have a daughter, she whispered, feeling the anger starting to blend with the anguish. Why didn't you tell me this before? James, aware of the impact of his words, tried to calm the situation. Sarah, I didn't know. I never knew Sofía was pregnant when she left. I found out recently, and we're waiting for the results of a DNA test to know for sure if Emily is my daughter. Sarah stood up from the table, her heart racing. She walked to the window, staring at the city lights, trying to control the tears that threatened to fall. I don't know how to handle this, James, she admitted, without turning to look at him. Our whole life, everything we've built, and now this young woman appears, who might be your daughter. I'm not trying to replace anything or change what we have, James replied, slowly approaching her. But I can't ignore this possibility. If Emily is my daughter, I deserve to know, and so does she. While James and Sarah dealt with the impact of the discoveries, Emily also faced her own internal conflicts. The revelation that James might be her biological father had shaken everything she knew about her life. She had grown up without a father, and her mother, Sofía, had always kept a veil of mystery around that subject. Sitting in her small apartment that same night, Emily couldn't stop thinking about the possibility that James was her father. The few photos she had of her mother were scattered on the table. She looked at each image carefully, searching for any clue that could confirm it. The apartment where she lived was small and modest, with white walls and simple furniture, a reflection of a life marked by the absence of answers. Why didn't you ever tell me, Mom? She whispered softly, as she stroked a photo of Sofía in which she was smiling. That night, Emily stayed awake, remembering the few times her mother mentioned the past. Although she always spoke with affection, there was a sadness in her words that now, with this new information, began to make sense. Had she been protecting her from the truth? The next day, Emily decided to visit her mother's grave. The small cemetery was on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by tall trees that shaded the tombstones. As she walked along the gravel path, the dry leaves crunched under her feet. She arrived at the spot where Sofía rested and knelt, placing a small flower on the cold stone headstone. I know you didn't tell me everything, she said quietly, her words floating in the air. But I'm starting to discover what happened. I just wish you were here to help me understand it all. The wind blew softly, caressing her skin as Emily closed her eyes. She felt like she was about to face a truth that would change her life forever. A week later, the moment of truth had arrived. Emily and James met in front of the clinic, both with their hearts racing. James looked at her before entering, noticing the mix of anxiety and fear on her face. No matter what happens, I want you to know that whatever the results say, I won't stop supporting you, he said, in a softer tone than usual. Emily looked at him, nodding slightly. Though doubts gnawed at her, a part of her wanted to know the truth. They entered the clinic, where the doctor was already waiting for them in his office. The room was small but cozy, with walls covered in diplomas and certificates. The doctor greeted them with a professional smile, holding an envelope in his hands. Mr. Smith, Emily, I have the results, he announced, opening the envelope with a calmness that only increased the tension in the room. The silence was overwhelming as the doctor read the report. Finally, he looked up, his expression neutral. The results are conclusive. Mr. Smith, you are Emily's biological father. The air in the room grew dense. Emily felt her world wobble as James brought a hand to his forehead, trying to assimilate what he had just heard. A mixture of relief, surprise, and fear overwhelmed him. For years, he had lived with the guilt of losing Sofía, and now, suddenly, he had a daughter. "I'm your father," James murmured, still in shock. Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. Despite the confusing emotions swirling inside her, she felt a strange comfort in knowing the truth. Both remained silent for a few moments, trying to process what had just happened. "I don't know how to do this," Emily said quietly, breaking the silence. "I've never had a father, and I don't know how I'm supposed to feel." James looked at her, understanding. "I don't know how to be the father of an adult daughter either, Emily," he replied, with a sad smile. "But if you give me the chance, I'd like to try. We can't get back the time we lost, but we can build something from now on." Emily nodded slowly, her emotions still swirling, but she felt that maybe, just maybe, she was willing to try. Meanwhile, Sarah had begun to reflect on the new reality her husband had revealed to her. Although the news had initially filled her with jealousy and insecurities, over time, she began to feel something different: curiosity. Who was this young woman who had suddenly become part of her life through James? She decided to take the first step and ask James to arrange a meeting between her and Emily. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but if this young woman was going to be part of her life, she needed to know her. The meeting took place in a quiet cafe in the city center. Emily arrived first, nervous about meeting her father's wife. She didn't know what to expect, and the idea of presenting herself to the woman who had shared her father's life intimidated her. Sarah arrived shortly after, looking impeccable in her elegant outfit. When the two women sat down, the atmosphere was charged with tension. However, Sarah was the first to break the ice. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me, Emily," Sarah began, with a tense smile. "I know this situation is complicated, but I wanted to meet you in person. I want to understand better how you feel, and if you're willing, I'd like us to give ourselves a chance to get to know each other." Emily, initially cautious, began to relax when she saw the sincerity in Sarah's words. "Thank you for wanting to meet me," Emily replied. "It hasn't been easy for me either, but I think I also want to understand all of this." For the next hour, the two women talked about their lives, about Sofía, and about what Emily's presence now meant in James's life. Though there were still many barriers to overcome, the meeting ended with a sense of hope that perhaps, over time, they could find a way to coexist in this new reality. After the DNA test results, both James and Emily knew their lives would never be the same again. However, despite the positive result, both were filled with uncertainty. How do you rebuild a bond that never existed? Though the result connected them undeniably, they didn't know how to start navigating this new father-daughter relationship. James, aware of the impact this would have on Emily, decided that they needed to take things slowly. He wanted to get closer to her, but he didn't want to overwhelm her. After all, he knew that having been her boss for months without knowing she was his daughter could have complicated her feelings. A few days after the results, James decided to invite Emily to his house. It wasn't easy to convince her, but in the end, Emily accepted, with a mix of curiosity and nervousness. James's house was enormous, a symbol of his success, and when Emily crossed the threshold for the first time, she felt completely out of place. James's mansion was decorated with contemporary art, designer furniture, and large windows that offered spectacular views of the city. As they toured the house, Emily couldn't help but feel small in comparison to the luxury around her. She had grown up in a modest apartment with her mother, and this contrast was overwhelming. "This is your house now too, if you ever need it," James said as he led her to the main living room, trying to ease the tension. Emily looked at him skeptically. Although she appreciated the gesture, she wasn't sure how she fit into this world so far from her own reality. It's a beautiful house, she replied, looking at the walls adorned with paintings. But I don't know if I feel like I'm part of this. James nodded. He knew it wouldn't be easy. I understand, he said, in a softer tone. I don't expect you to feel part of all this right away. I just want you to know you have a place here, if you ever need it. They sat in the living room, surrounded by a collection of leather furniture and a lit fireplace that emitted a soft glow. The atmosphere was comfortable, but the conversation was still a bit tense. Would you like to know more about your mother? James asked after a while, noticing how Emily was looking at one of the family photos on the coffee table. Emily looked up, surprised by the question. She had never had many details about Sofía, and now, knowing that James knew her so well, her curiosity was more awakened than ever. Yes, she replied, trying to hide the emotion that overwhelmed her. Mom was always very reserved about her past. She hardly ever talked about you, and when she did, it was like, she didn't want to relive those moments. James nodded, his face darkening with memories. Sofía was an incredible woman, he began, his voice laden with nostalgia. Full of life, passionate about art, and she always found beauty in the simplest things. I fell in love with her because she had that ability to see the world in a way I couldn't. I was all about business, ambitions, and goals, and she taught me that there was more to life than just that. Emily listened in silence, absorbing every word. She couldn't help but think about the life her mother had led before she was born, and the relationship she might have had with James if things had been different. Did you ever think of looking for her? Emily asked, with a hint of doubt in her voice. After she left, I mean. James nodded, lowering his gaze. I tried, Emily. After she left, I spent months looking for her. I hired private detectives, even talked to mutual friends, but it was like she had completely disappeared. There came a point where I had to accept that she didn't want to be found. Silence settled between them. Emily didn't know what to say. It was clear that James had suffered Sophia's absence as much as she had, but there was still much to understand. While James and Emily were getting to know each other, Sarah was watching everything from a distance, trying to find her place in this new reality. Though she had accepted that Emily was now part of James's life, something was deeply unsettling her. It wasn't just Emily's presence, but the ghost of Sofía, the woman who had shared a love with James before she had come into his life. Sarah, without telling James, decided to investigate more about Sofía. She wanted to understand what kind of relationship they had had and whether the shadow of that woman was still present in her husband's mind. She reached out to a family friend, Javier, who was a private investigator. She knew James had used his services in the past, and she hoped he could shed some light on what had happened with Sofía. Javier, I need your help with something, Sarah said when she visited him in his office, a dark and small place, but full of files and papers. Tell me, what can I do for you? Javier asked, intrigued by the seriousness in Sarah's voice. I want you to investigate more about Sofía, Emily's mother. I need to understand more about who she was and what really happened between her and James. Javier raised an eyebrow. He knew this could be a delicate subject, especially since James had tried to find Sofía without success years ago. Are you sure you want to do this? He asked, doubtful. James might not be happy if he finds out you're investigating Sofía on your own. I know, but I need answers, Sarah replied, firmly. If this woman is influencing my relationship with my husband, I need to know. Javier accepted Sarah's request and began tracing any information that might have remained hidden about Sofía. What he found left him perplexed. There were records that Sofía hadn't disappeared by choice, but had been forced to leave her life behind due to pressures from someone very powerful. When Javier discovered the truth, he immediately called Sarah to meet her in private. Sarah, I found something important about Sofía, Javier said when they met at a cafe on the outskirts of the city. She didn't leave on her own. She was forced to. Sarah looked at him, eyes wide. Forced. By whom? She asked, feeling a chill down her spine. I don't have all the details yet, but it seems there was someone in James's life, someone with enough power to pressure Sofía and force her to disappear. I don't know who it was yet, but this isn't what it seems. There's something much darker behind her disappearance. Sarah remained silent, processing what she had just heard. This new information could change everything. What else was there in James's past that she didn't know? While Sarah was investigating the mystery of Sofía, an old enemy of James, someone who had tried to sabotage his success in the past, reappeared on the scene. Alberto, a former partner of James's, had been resentful ever since his business collapsed while James's thrived. For years, Alberto had been conspiring to find a way to take revenge, and the reappearance of Emily and the story of Sofía gave him the angle he needed. Alberto, who was believed to have disappeared from James's life, had secretly been the one who pressured Sofía to leave him. Now, with Emily back in James's life, Alberto saw the perfect opportunity to destabilize his life. One afternoon, as James left a meeting in his office, an unmarked envelope was left on his desk. Inside, he found old photos of Sofía and Emily as a child. There was no note, but the message was clear: someone knew more than they were saying. The photos reminded him that his past could still affect him, and that there was something about Sofía's disappearance that he hadn't uncovered. Meanwhile, paranoia began to set in his life. He knew that someone was pulling the strings from the shadows, and that both he and Emily were in danger. James felt a pressure in his chest as he contemplated the old photographs left on his desk. The image of Sofía smiling, with Emily in her arms, provoked a mixture of nostalgia and deep pain in him, but what disturbed him most was the clear threat behind this message. The past, which he had tried so hard to leave behind, was coming back to haunt him. Determined not to lose control of the situation, he contacted Javier immediately. He knew his private investigator could help him figure out who was behind this. Javier, something strange is happening, James said when Javier arrived at his office. I received this today, with no note. Just photos of Sofía and Emily as a child. I don't understand how, but someone's been watching me, and they're using my past to intimidate me. Javier examined the photos carefully and nodded, already sensing that this was something bigger. Alberto, he murmured. This kind of tactic feels familiar. You did the right thing by calling me. I'll investigate where these photos came from and see if I can trace their origin, but I must warn you, Alberto is more dangerous than you think. He's always resented you, and if he's involved, he's likely seeking revenge. James felt a chill down his spine. He hadn't thought about Alberto in years, but he knew this man had been his most relentless rival, willing to use any trick to destroy those who stood in his way. Do you think he had something to do with Sofía's disappearance? James asked, his words filled with uncertainty and fear. Javier nodded slowly. I wouldn't rule it out. Years ago, you tried to find Sofía without success, but someone was actively working to ensure you didn't. This could be that someone. If Alberto was involved in her disappearance, then he could also be behind Emily growing up without her mother and, more importantly, without knowing anything about you. I have to protect Emily, James said, determined. I can't let Alberto or anyone else use this past to hurt her. I've already lost too much time. Javier assured him that he would investigate every possible lead, and James, though still worried, felt some relief knowing he wasn't alone in this anymore. While James dealt with the threat of Alberto, Sarah continued her own investigation without telling her husband. She was determined to uncover who had forced Sofía to disappear, and with every step she took, she became more convinced that someone close to James had been involved. One night, after James had gone to bed, Sarah went over the documents Javier had gathered again. She found something that deeply disturbed her. There was a pattern in Alberto's financial activities that coincided with the last few months before Sofía disappeared. Everything pointed to someone having financed her disappearance, and that someone seemed to be Alberto. She decided to confront James about it, but not aggressively. She knew the moment was delicate, and she needed to handle the situation carefully. One afternoon, while they were having coffee in the living room of their mansion, Sarah decided to talk to him. "James," she began softly, her voice filled with concern. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened with Emily and Sofía. And I can't help but wonder if there's something more behind her disappearance." James, who hadn't noticed Sarah's worry until that moment, frowned. "What do you mean?" he asked, not fully understanding what she was getting at. Sarah sighed, trying to choose her words carefully. "I think someone might have forced Sofía to disappear. I've been talking to Javier." She paused, waiting for James's reaction, who looked at her in surprise, and he believes Alberto might have been behind all of this. It's possible that Sofía didn't leave on her own but was pressured into doing so. James's face tensed upon hearing those words. Though the idea that Sofía had been forced to disappear had crossed his mind, hearing Sarah say it out loud shook him. "Are you sure about what you're saying?" he asked, his voice heavy. "Why didn't you tell me before that you were investigating this?" Sarah looked him in the eye, feeling the weight of her decision. "I did it because I thought you deserved to know the truth, James. I love you, and I don't want anything from the past to destroy you, but I also know that if there's more behind all of this, we need to face it together." James was silent for a few moments. Sarah's revelation made him feel vulnerable but also grateful. He knew she was right. If Alberto was behind it all, not only had he hurt Sofía, but he was now threatening his current family. "Thank you for telling me," he finally said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You're right. I can't ignore this. We need to find out what really happened." Alberto didn't take long to stop acting from the shadows. Instead of just sending photos and subtle signals, he decided to take action. One afternoon, as Emily left the supermarket after her shift, a black cart discreetly followed her. She didn't notice it until, upon arriving at her building, the car stopped just a few meters from her. Emily looked around, feeling that something wasn't right. The man who got out of the car watched her with a sinister smile, and though she didn't recognize him, fear began to settle in her chest. "Miss Emily, right?" the man said, approaching slowly. "Who are you?" she asked, stepping back, her heart pounding. "I'm just a family friend," he replied, his voice calm but threatening. "I've come to give you a message. There are things better left uninvestigated, for your own good and for your family's. Some secrets are better left buried." Emily felt her skin crawl. She knew something dangerous was happening, and this man was somehow linked to her father's situation. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, trying to stay calm as she reached for her phone in her pocket to call someone. The man took a step closer, narrowing the distance between them. "Oh, of course you do. Your father, James, should have learned by now not to meddle where he's not wanted. But it seems he hasn't, has he?" Emily felt a knot in her stomach. This man knew her father, and everything indicated that he was connected to Alberto. Without another word, the man got back into the car and drove off slowly, leaving her alone and scared in the middle of the street. Trembling, Emily called James immediately. She knew something was about to happen, and she couldn't sit idly by. "Dad, someone followed me to my house," she said, her voice shaking when James answered the phone. "They warned me to stop investigating." "What's going on?" James felt a surge of anger and concern when he heard Emily's voice. This had gone too far. He couldn't allow his daughter, who had already suffered so much, to be dragged into this dark story. "I'm coming over right now," he replied, his voice firm. "Don't worry, Emily. I won't let them hurt you." With his daughter's safety at risk and the fear that the situation would escalate even further, James decided it was time to confront Alberto directly. He couldn't let the man who had once destroyed his life do it again, especially not with Emily involved. Javier, after weeks of investigation, finally managed to track down Alberto, who was hiding out in a luxurious residential complex outside the city. James knew he had to go personally. He couldn't delegate this to anyone else. When he arrived at the location, a tense atmosphere took over the scene. Alberto, who greeted him with a mocking smile, was sure he had the upper hand. "James, James. What brings you here?" he said with an ironic laugh as he sipped a glass of wine. "After all these years, have you finally decided to come and ask for forgiveness?" James looked at him with restrained rage. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness, Alberto. I'm here to put an end to all of this. I don't know what made you think you could meddle in my life again, but I won't let you play with my daughter's life." Alberto took a step forward, his expression darkening. "Your daughter," he spat, his voice now filled with resentment. "That girl shouldn't even exist. Sofía should never have been with you, and if it weren't for me, she would have left everything long before." James's face hardened. Now he knew the truth. Alberto had been behind Sofía's disappearance, orchestrating everything so he would believe she had abandoned him. And now, he was trying to destroy everything that was left. "Sofía left because you forced her," James said, advancing towards him. "All this time, I thought she had abandoned me, but it was you who drove her away from me." Alberto smiled, as if James's words were insignificant to him. "You'll never understand, will you? It wasn't just about her. It was about you. You destroyed my life, James. Everything I had, I lost because of you, and now, it's my turn." But James wasn't willing to keep playing his game. He lunged at Alberto, stopping him once and for all, while security and Javier made sure he didn't escape. Finally, Alberto was arrested and brought to justice for all his past crimes. With the threat of Alberto finally eliminated, James, Emily, and Sarah were able to start rebuilding their lives. Though they knew they couldn't get back the time they had lost, they knew they had the chance to start anew, as a united family. Emily, who had learned more about her mother and the dark past surrounding her, felt that she could finally find peace. She wasn't alone. She had a father who, despite his past mistakes, was willing to do everything to protect her. The bond between James and Emily grew stronger over time, and though the scars of the past would remain, both knew the future was full of possibilities. The end. Hope you enjoyed it. Please don't forget to subscribe, give a like, and click notifications so you don't miss any new content.